In the shadow of the Blue Ridge Mountains, just outside the growing town of Asheville, North Carolina, lies a patch of land locals still avoid. What looks like nothing more than a public utility yard was once the site of a structure so infamous that city officials tried to erase it from maps, documents, and memory. From 1835 until its fiery collapse in 1869, it housed the Drexler Institution for the Correction of Women, a privately run religious facility founded by the Drexler family. Immigrants who arrived from Prussia with pious intentions and something far darker hidden behind their holy convictions. Officially, the institution claimed to reform fallen women through prayer, isolation, and structured labor. In reality, it operated as a state-sanctioned chamber of horrors, where psychological manipulation and physical torment were refined into an industrial process. Over its 34-year reign, nearly 500 women were processed through the Drexler gates. Less than 150 ever left. Most were never seen again. Local legend says the Appalachian ground still remembers their screams. The building itself was a converted textile mill, 4 stories of heavy brick and narrow windows, perched on a hill where fog clung like a shroud. Purchased cheaply during a bankruptcy auction, it was outfitted with reinforced walls, underground rooms, and a maze-like layout so disorienting that escape was nearly impossible. Even in the bright hours of midday, the place felt like it was in perpetual dusk. The Drexler family sealed off its history with stone and fire, but not before leaving behind a blueprint of methodical cruelty that would be rediscovered a century later. It wasn't until a sewer line project in 1932 that city workers unearthed the buried lower chambers. Inside were ledgers, shackles, and remnants of an institution that had long since been dismissed as urban myth. The truth was far worse than any ghost story. What followed was a slow unraveling of secrets, sealed testimonies, coded correspondence, and a paper trail that led straight into the heart of North Carolina's 19th century elite. But before we reach that reckoning, we must start with the patriarch himself, Warden Albrecht Drexler, a man whose name once inspired reverence, then terror, and eventually silence. Albrecht Drexler stood 6'4", a frame that dwarfed most men of his time. Born in the Black Forest region of Prussia, he'd once served as a military chaplain during the Napoleonic Wars before immigrating to America in 1829. Locals described him as regal, disciplined, and terrifyingly calm. He carried the air of a man who believed he was on a divine mission, one sanctioned by scripture, justified by law, and protected by influence. By the time he reached Asheville, he had already built a reputation as a devout man of order, quick to quote passages from both the Old and New Testaments with equal intensity. But what set him apart wasn't his theological knowledge, it was his obsession with obedience. He believed that the soul could be reshaped through control of the body. Pain to him was not a punishment, but a purifier. Sin was not to be forgiven. It was to be burned out. In 1834, Drexler secured funding from a coalition of private donors and clergy to establish a restorative refuge for women whose behavior had fallen outside Christian propriety. He presented the plan with eloquence and promises of moral reform. Local ministers and judges applauded him. But behind the well-rehearsed speeches and polished manners was a man who had never recovered from the death of his wife and infant daughter back in Europe, an event he interpreted as divine punishment for a lack of discipline. His new institution would be a place to rectify that loss by forcing order onto chaos, specifically feminine chaos. The Drexler Institution opened on February 3, 1835, and within weeks, the first women arrived. Most were poor, many were immigrants. Some were as young as 13. Their crimes? Walking unaccompanied after dark, laughing too loudly in church, or simply being inconvenient to a powerful man. Albrecht ruled the place with a cleric's tongue and a general's hand. His daily inspections were marked by silence and a heavy wooden cane that he carried but rarely used. He didn't need to. His presence alone kept the women trembling. They called him the ghost preacher because he never raised his voice and never smiled. But Albrecht Drexler did not run the institution alone. Behind his cold command stood a family just as complicit, and in many ways far more twisted. If Albrecht Drexler was the iron fist of the institution, his wife's niece, Matilda Brecht, was its scalpel. Arriving from Baltimore in 1836, she brought with her a refined education and a reputation for unshakable piety. At only 28, she had already served as a supervisor at 2 women's workhouses. But what set her apart wasn't her administrative skill. It was her ability to wear the mask of maternal compassion while orchestrating some of the most calculated cruelty the institution would ever see. Matilda believed suffering was essential to salvation. She would comfort women one moment and order their isolation the next, framing each punishment as an act of divine mercy. Her rooms were perfumed, her handwriting elegant, and her ledger notes terrifying in their coldness. Subject 024, one note read, refuses to confess fornication, may require fasting and water deprivation. She considered herself a healer of souls, a surgeon excising the disease of disobedience. Then there was Emmerich Drexler, Albrecht's younger brother, a failed seminarian who had been expelled from divinity school in Vienna for moral deviations. Emmerich became the institution's chaplain, an architect of theology twisted for obedience. He rewrote sermons to fit the family's doctrine, turning passages into weapons. To him, God was a warden, not a shepherd. He believed that breaking a woman's mind was the first step toward reconstructing her soul. During confession, he would speak so softly that women leaned in, only to hear him dismantle their sense of self, scripture by scripture. His knowledge of religious texts was encyclopedic. He used it to justify everything, beatings as divine correction, starvation as fasting for clarity, and silence as the first step toward inner redemption. If a woman cried, he quoted Proverbs. If she resisted, he cited Job. His private journals, found years later, described his sermons as experiments. The last key player in this unholy alliance was Clara Drexler, Albrecht's daughter from his first marriage. Only 19 when the institution opened, Clara had been groomed from childhood to see compassion as weakness. She was in charge of the day room, where women worked, washing, stitching, pressing garments for the town's wealthier families. Her lashes never left the floor as she walked through rows of bent backs and calloused hands. It was Clara who first suggested dividing the women by potential value, and that idea would lead to the darkest innovation of all. The Drexler institution sat atop Windrow Hill like a watchtower over the town, its exterior clean and severe, arched brickwork, black lacquered iron gates, and a tall white steeple that gave it the illusion of holiness. To the townsfolk, it appeared like any other religious structure of the era, but to those who entered, the illusion didn't last past the first door. Upon entry, women were stripped of their names, clothing, and possessions. Each was issued a rough gray dress with no buttons, a canvas apron, and a wooden tag bearing only a number. From that point forward, they were not referred to as Miss or Mrs., but simply by that number, driven into them during roll call, labor assignments, and punishments. The building itself had been transformed with unsettling intention. Windows were sealed with mortar, allowing only thin slits of daylight that barely lit the halls. The floors creaked constantly, disorienting footsteps. The walls were painted in dark olive and soot-gray tones that swallowed light, creating a sensation of perpetual dusk. Hallways looped and turned abruptly, leading to dead ends or identical doors, none of which had labels. Maps were forbidden. Clocks were removed. This was by design. The layout made it impossible for newcomers to know time, place, or direction. Day blurred into night. Sundays were indistinguishable from Thursdays. When one woman began marking days into her skin with a sewing needle, Matilda had her hands bound for a week as punishment for clinging to false structures. The basement, accessible only through a locked hatch, housed the Hollow, a series of soundproof rooms lined with wool-padded walls and iron rings. These were used for solitary confinement, night visits from clients, or what the family called intensive reflection. Few women emerged from the Hollow unchanged. Most never spoke of it. A few never returned at all. And the upper floors, which housed dormitories and workrooms, were designed to fracture the mind. Beds were placed precisely 18 inches apart, facing away from windows. Lights were extinguished at unpredictable hours, and wake-up bells rang inconsistently, sometimes twice in the same night. Sleep became a privilege, not a necessity. Over time, women stopped asking questions. They forgot the names of their own mothers. They wept at the smell of soap or the sound of a hymn. The building didn't just trap bodies, it erased identities. And that, more than the punishments, was what the Drexler family had always intended. The intake process at the Drexler institution was not merely administrative, it was ritual. Every new arrival passed through what the staff called the threshold, a sterile chamber on the ground floor that reeked of damp stone and vinegar. It was here that the transformation from person to property began. Each woman was ordered to strip, regardless of age or condition. Her belongings, rings, letters, locks of hair, were confiscated, sorted into trays, and taken to a fire pit behind the building. The burning was ceremonial. Emmerich Drexler would stand over the flames, reading psalms while the women watched their former lives turn to ash. Then came the examination. Clara Drexler, despite her youth, oversaw this phase with cold precision. With a nurse's detachment, she recorded the women's physical traits in a black ledger: height, weight, eye color, dental condition, any visible scars or flaws. They were measured not for health, but for marketability. Whether a woman might be useful as a servant, laborer, or something worse, was decided within the first hour of her arrival. Following the physical inspection, Emmerich conducted what he called the spiritual indexing. In a dim chamber lit only by a single candle, he questioned each woman about her upbringing, religious background, family ties, fears, and former sins. His tone was gentle, almost priestly, but the information was not for her benefit. It was for the family's client files. A girl who feared confinement would be placed near locked cells. One who missed her mother would be housed beside a senile woman who screamed in the night. Everything was curated to erode resistance and produce compliance. Once indexed, each woman received her number and assignment. Some went to the laundry floors, others to textile work. A few, usually the youngest or most docile, were placed on the top floor in what staff called the Airy, a quiet corridor reserved for women being prepared for personal visits from patrons of the institution. These visits were labeled moral interventions in the records. Within days, new arrivals stopped looking each other in the eye. Within weeks, they stopped speaking altogether. The silent halls of the Drexler institution weren't peaceful. They were broken. To the outside world, the institution produced model citizens, reformed women, humble and devout, released with glowing letters of character. But inside, those who survived the intake ritual quickly understood the truth. They had vanished, and no one was coming to find them. To the citizens of Asheville, the Drexler institution stood as a pillar of Christian virtue. Local judges praised its moral efficiency. Clergymen gave sermons extolling its redemptive mission. Even merchants contributed supplies, unaware, or perhaps willfully blind, to the reality behind its high iron gates. Twice a year, the institution held what they called a renewal ceremony, during which a handful of women were released into the public eye, dressed modestly, heads bowed, speaking in quiet tones of gratitude. These women, selected with care, were not chosen for their progress, but for their passivity. They were paraded through the town square like trophies of salvation. Each graduate was handed a letter of character signed by Albrecht Drexler himself. These documents opened doors to employment as housemaids, laundresses, and caretakers, positions arranged through Clara's business contacts. But what townspeople didn't see were the restrictions these women carried, threats of reinstitution for any perceived disobedience. Many lived in fear, never straying far, always watching for a Drexler crest on official envelopes. For those who remained behind, the idea of release became its own form of torture. Matilda Brecht weaponized it with finesse. She would summon a woman nearing the end of her sentence into the chapel room, praise her progress, hint at release, and then revoke the offer a day later over some minor infraction. A stitch out of place, a missed curtsy, an unspoken apology. Each revocation reinforced the idea that freedom was not earned through goodness, but through obedience. The daily routine was structured to the minute. Wake-up bell at 4:30 a.m., a cold basin wash in communal troughs, a meager breakfast of boiled oats, labor from 6 o'clock a.m. to noon, followed by 1 hour of moral instruction, led by Emmerich, who often delivered sermons so intense that women fainted in place. The afternoons were for textile work and confession sessions. Evening meals were punishment-based, missed steps meant no food, and nights were a gamble. Sometimes they passed in eerie silence. Other times, footsteps in the corridor meant a woman would not return to her bunk. The illusion of redemption was the institution's greatest deception. Outwardly, it presented progress. Internally, it offered only degradation disguised as virtue. And yet, clients lined up, politicians donated, churches wrote endorsements. Because what the Drexler family offered wasn't salvation, it was silence. And for many in power, silence was the most valuable product of all. Beneath the cross that crowned the institution's white steeple, behind the sermons and slogans, stood a clientele as vast as it was vile. The Drexlers did not merely run a religious facility, they maintained a highly structured network of customers, benefactors, and collaborators who kept the machine running, oiled not with charity, but coin. Officially, they called them moral partners. These were businessmen, judges, physicians, and clergy from Asheville and beyond, who financially supported the institution in exchange for private access to its inmates, under the guise of rehabilitation counseling. Unofficially, they were buyers in a market built on human compliance. Each partner was offered a menu of access: weekly visits, private confessionals, even participation in spiritual instruction. Emmerich Drexler, with his sly eloquence, crafted theological justifications for every arrangement. "The Lord works through those willing to confront sin directly," he once wrote in a letter to a Methodist bishop who frequented the Airy. There were different tiers, too. Tier 1, observation access. Men were permitted to watch labor sessions or prayer gatherings through tinted glass. Tier 2, guided intervention. One-on-one meetings with selected women under the pretext of counseling. Tier 3, complete discretion, granted only to the wealthiest or most powerful. These sessions occurred at night in the hidden East Wing, beneath rooms falsely labeled storage. Clara Drexler managed the profiles. She maintained files for each woman, tracking behavior, resilience, triggers. Notes like, responds well to praise, or shuts down with loud voices, guided the family's decisions on pairings. Matilda, ever efficient, ensured the chosen women were prepped, groomed, clothed in clean linen, and reminded that refusal would result in extension of redemption time. And yet, to outsiders, the place remained a miracle. Testimonials were published in religious pamphlets. Saved, women were occasionally allowed to send letters, dictated and censored, of course, thanking the Drexlers for their spiritual rescue. Churches held fundraisers. One even installed a stained glass window in the family's honor. But within the basement, behind the bricked-up halls and locked trapdoors, the truth was flesh and coin. Human souls, bartered in whispers. Albrecht Drexler's vision had triumphed, not as a house of God, but as a marketplace where redemption had a price. And every man of power in Asheville, whether they knew it or not, had already paid. Behind a false wall in Albrecht Drexler's private study was a narrow recess barely wide enough for a man's shoulder. Inside it hung a steel cabinet with no keyhole, no handle, only a shallow cross carved into the face. Hidden within was the ledger of souls, the true record of the institution's business. Names, dates, client lists, payments, selections, and, most disturbingly, notes. It was Thomas Keeler, a stonemason turned night watchman, who first described it decades later in a testimony recorded near the end of his life. Hired by the Drexlers as a quiet man, Keeler had swept the halls after hours and kept the stoves burning in the lower wings. One night in 1859, he was called to fix a jammed panel in the Reverend's office. That was when he saw the cabinet open, its black books glowing under candlelight. Each volume bore no title, just a number. The pages inside were meticulously written in Emmerich's hand. Notations beside women's names included phrases like silenced after incident, compliant under duress, expected to survive no more than 9 months, and in some cases, simply unfit for return. But most chilling were the entries under the column marked client experience. These were not clinical. They were indulgent, descriptions of what clients had requested, what had been delivered, how the women responded. Many included initials or full names of donors, judges, and religious leaders from across the state. One client, referred to as J.H., was described as preferring girls under 18 with limited English. Another, Reverend M.B., had requested spiritual resistance sessions, involving long hours of prayer in freezing rooms followed by personal interrogation. The ledgers showed that the Drexlers didn't just profit from forced labor. They had created a full-service industry built on the personalization of degradation, and they had done it with the knowledge, and often participation, of North Carolina's religious and political elite. The family's financial system mirrored that of any legitimate business. Income was routed through fake charitable funds, textile orders, and donations from churches. Receipts were forged, balances were split between local banks and overseas holdings. Albrecht's genius wasn't in his brutality. It was in making it invisible. That cabinet remained hidden until decades after the institution burned. But for those who lived there, whose names filled those ledgers, it had always been visible. It was in the cold stares, the vanished voices, the bruises explained as penance, In that book, they weren't women. They were inventory. In the spring of 1863, a 17-year-old girl named Lena Voller arrived at the Drexler institution. Her offense: she'd been accused of indecent behavior after being seen conversing with a Union soldier near the Asheville train station. The soldier was later reassigned. Lena was not so lucky. She came from a modest German family, her father a glassmaker, her mother deceased. She was fluent in both English and German and known for wearing a red ribbon around her neck, a keepsake from her younger sister. That ribbon was confiscated within her first hour inside the institution and burned in front of her. Lena was assigned the number 371 and placed in textile labor on the second floor. She adapted quickly, too quickly. Within days, she had memorized the layout of the halls, noting the rhythm of guard patrols, the irregular bell schedules, and which doors had faulty hinges. Clara Drexler noticed her intelligence and moved her to the Eyrie, where compliant women were groomed for patron interaction. But Lena was neither compliant nor broken. She began leaving messages, short phrases etched into wood with sewing needles, hidden beneath cots and inside pillow seams. Remember your name. The morning bell is false. Don't eat on Thursdays. Her coded messages spread among the women like embers. Even as she obeyed orders publicly, Lena built a quiet resistance, piecing together schedules, hierarchies, even the financial ledgers she caught glimpses of during her evening cleaning assignments. One night in late September, she made it to the third-floor records room, an area off-limits to anyone without the Drexler name. What she saw there is unknown, but by morning, she was gone. The official log claimed she had been discharged to family, but her father never saw her again. No paperwork was filed with county clerks. Her name disappeared from the release ledgers. Her number, 371, was reassigned the next week to a mute Irish girl who arrived on a morality conviction. Months later, new carvings began appearing on the inner beams of the washroom. She's in the hollow. Look behind the pulpit. Red still burns. Some believe Lena never escaped, that she was hidden, silenced, or worse. Others believe she started a chain of resistance that would culminate in the institution's exposure years later. Whatever the truth, the ribbon returned. In the rubble of the East Wing fire, one charred red strip of fabric was found nailed to a cellar door. Next to it, a number etched in iron, 371. The Drexlers were not fools. They knew the risk of exposure was greatest not from rebellion, but from scrutiny. Too many questions asked by outsiders, or one wrong visitor granted access to too much truth. That's why they cultivated a secret weapon, one more insidious than the ledgers or the locked doors. Her name was Agnes Vale, and to the town of Asheville, she was a saint, a widow of a railroad magnate and the founder of the Ladies' Benevol. Lent Association for Reformed Women, Agnes served as the public face of the Drexler Institution's supposed charity work. She was elegant, educated, and devout, delivering passionate speeches at church galas about moral uplift and the blessings of feminine obedience. Her organization published quarterly newsletters filled with carefully edited testimonies, photographs of reformed women posed in white lace, and donation slips pre-addressed to the institution. Agnes had never stepped into the hollow. She never saw the punishment cells, never heard the screams during night services, never touched the cold iron collar worn by the defiant. But she knew. She had to. It was Agnes who arranged for judges across Buncombe County to sentence women directly to the institution under the Moral Reform Statutes of 1856. It was Agnes who redirected complaints from concerned relatives to her association's Oversight Committee, which existed only on paper. And it was Agnes who helped secure tax exemptions and state contracts for the Drexler family, framing the institution as an essential part of North Carolina's moral infrastructure. Her motivation was not wealth. She had plenty. It was reputation. She saw herself as a steward of virtue, the kind who believed that order mattered more than justice. Her visits to the institution were always announced. The halls were scrubbed. Women were handpicked and drilled in advance on what to say. When one girl, assigned number 212, tried to whisper, "Please help us," during a photo session, Agnes reportedly tightened her grip on the girl's shoulder and smiled for the camera. The girl was never seen again. Behind her white gloves and silver brooch, Agnes Vale ensured that the Drexlers were untouchable. She wrapped the entire institution in a shroud of sanctity so thick that even the most skeptical newspaper editors refused to question it. She did, and have to lock doors or swing canes. She simply made sure no one ever looked inside. By the winter of 1868, the Drexler institution was showing signs of fracture, not from the inside but from the periphery. Whispers in Asheville's taverns, missing court documents, the quiet disappearance of a local merchant's niece after a morality conviction. Detective Jonas Lyle, a Civil War veteran turned city investigator, had begun charting what he called a pattern of vanishing women. Lyle wasn't the type to believe in ghost stories, but after the third family came to him claiming their daughter had never returned from a court-mandated period of moral rehabilitation, he started keeping a ledger of his own. He noted the dates of sentencing, cross-checked them with official discharge papers, and found gaps, months-long gaps, and in some cases, no discharge at all. He attempted to visit the institution under official business. He was turned away. The Drexlers had reason to worry. Their paper shields, fabricated logs, charitable front companies, Agnes Vale's benevolent speeches could only hide so much. If someone were to access the real records, if a woman escaped and testified, the entire machine could unravel. So they devised a plan. On January 11th, 1869, a fire broke out in the southwest laundry room at precisely 3:12 a.m. According to the official report, it was caused by an overturned lantern and unattended linen oil. But the reality was far more sinister. Witnesses saw smoke rise in multiple locations almost simultaneously. Others later testified to hearing doors being locked from the outside while the fire spread. The plan was simple: eliminate the building, destroy the records, and blame the loss of life on misfortune. But what the Drexlers hadn't calculated was the wind. By 4 a.m., the fire had spread to the central stairwell and ignited the wooden rafters above the eyrie. By 4:15, the eastern wing was consumed. By 4:30, 2 neighboring houses were smoldering. And by dawn, local fire brigades, alongside alarmed townsfolk, had broken through the gates with hatchets and wet cloths tied over their faces. What they found turned even the strongest men pale. Charred doorways opened into rooms lined with shackles. Some women were still alive, crawling through soot on burned hands. Others were found slumped in chains, blackened but not yet cooled. In one corner of the collapsed east wing, rescuers found an iron-bound cabinet, melted but intact. Inside were ledgers, and inside those ledgers names that no one had expected to see. The ledgers recovered from the scorched cabinet were warped by heat, the pages fused in places, but not all. Fire Chief Albert Wynne, who had taken it upon himself to guard the Drexler ruins until authorities arrived, described the discovery as like pulling bones from a grave. The first names were expected: women committed for vague infractions, poor immigrants, girls sentenced by familiar judges. But deeper within the pages, a more troubling pattern emerged. Client records, signatures, payments, requests. There, in precise black ink, was the name of Judge Thaddeus Creel, who had publicly decried moral looseness for over a decade. Another, Reverend Joel Simmons, pastor of Mount White Baptist Church, who had once given a stirring sermon in support of the Drexler family's work. Still another, Mayor Horace Calloway, beside a note reading, "Prefers silence, no bruising." Each name was accompanied by coded remarks, some in Emmerich's hand, others in Matilda's, phrases like "same as last visit," "wishes 213 transferred to isolation for further reflection," or simply "compliant, extend duration." The town of Asheville was stunned. Newspapers, previously cautious to print anything critical of the Drexlers, now exploded with sensational headlines. "House of Virtue or Den of Torment?" asked the Asheville Tribune. One article published survivors' testimonies in full, unedited and brutal, forced fasting, burning punishment, spiritual correction through submission. The illusion was shattered. But not everyone wanted justice. Within days, attempts were made to reclaim or destroy the ledgers. The courthouse that housed the documents was broken into. A fire broke out in the records annex. Testimonies vanished. Survivors were threatened, some disappearing after giving statements. Agnes Vale fled to Virginia, claiming health concerns. Judge Creel took a leave of absence and died mysteriously 2 weeks later, some say by his own hand, others whispered poison. Reverend Simmons gave one final sermon before vanishing from public life entirely. His last words at the pulpit, "We must not speak what will damn us." Only a few stood firm. Fire Chief Wynne, Detective Lyle, and a young journalist named Cyrus Bell, who had lost a cousin to the institution in 1862. Together, they preserved what remained, burying duplicates of the ledgers in 3 separate locations in case of further sabotage. And they made a list of every man who had walked through those basement halls and called it redemption. The town called it scandal. But for the women who survived, it was finally something else. Truth. When the fire tore through the Drexler institution, most eyes were fixed on the basement. The chains, the scorched ledgers, the rooms where horror wore the face of discipline. But one group of volunteer rescuers, led by a carpenter named Ezra Callan, broke into the upper floors as embers still fell like snow. What they found was not recorded in the official inquest. It was whispered, decade later by Callan's granddaughter, who heard it from him on the day he died. The attic had always been sealed. No staircase led to it. Only a small iron ladder behind a bolted trap door concealed in the linen closet on the 3rd floor. By the time Ezra and his team pried it open, smoke had thickened, choking their lungs. But they climbed. Inside, the space was low-ceilinged and suffocatingly hot, lined with rows of makeshift cots, rough blankets, buckets for waste. The only light came from 2 slits in the brick that faced east. The air smelled of urine, mold, and something else, blood long dried. There were 6 women in that attic, alive. They were too weak to speak at first. Their hair was falling out, their limbs too thin to carry them upright. One woman, identified only as No. 418, had apparently been there for years. The others had been brought up slowly, one by one, over time. Their records had all listed them as released, but they'd never left. One woman still wore a fragment of her church dress beneath her shift. Another gripped a carved piece of wood bearing the letter M, possibly for a daughter or a sister she hadn't seen in years. But the most haunting was the woman in the corner. She was seated upright, eyes open, arms bound to the iron frame of a chair with cloth that had long turned black. At first, They believed she was dead, but when Ezra touched her wrist, she blinked once, slowly. Carved into the wall beside her in delicate script were 3 words: still not saved. She never spoke again. Some said she had been part of a failed escape attempt in 1861. Others believed she had once been a teacher, an educated woman who refused to break and had been locked away as an example. Her name was never confirmed, but in town she came to be known as the Patroness, the woman who endured every horror the Drexlers created and lived long enough to be seen. A monument now stands where that attic was found, but her true memorial is in the silence, and in the fact that she remembered when no one else dared to. The trial of the Drexlers was never what people hoped it would be. By the time formal charges were brought in the fall of 1869, the family had fractured. Albrecht Drexler was found dead days after the fire, face down in a stone wash basin behind the chapel, his skull split by what investigators described as an object consistent with a brick or a wrench. No tools were ever recovered. Some whispered it was one of the attic women. Others claimed it was his brother, Emmerich, silencing the only man who knew every name. Clara Drexler had fled. Rumors placed her in New Orleans, then farther west. A woman matching her description was arrested in 1873 under the name Clara Sen, suspected of operating a rehabilitation home in Kansas. But no one ever proved the connection. Matilda Brecht was captured and held in a locked ward in Raleigh. At her hearing, she wept not for her actions, but for the degradation of moral standards among modern women. Her defense? That she had merely followed Scripture. When presented with evidence of torture, starvation, and psychological torment, she replied, "Suffering is the path to salvation. I only lit the way." She was declared unfit for trial and spent the remainder of her life in a sanatorium near Durham. Staff reported she spent her final years writing long, rambling prayers addressed not to God, but to the institution. Emmerich Drexler was the only one formally tried. He represented himself. For 5 days he delivered sermons from the defense bench, quoting scripture with terrifying fluency. When the prosecutor read from the ledgers, listing his handwriting beside descriptions of women broken for client satisfaction, Emmerich smiled and whispered, "We all serve God in our own way." The jury deliberated for 3 hours. He was found guilty of criminal conspiracy, false imprisonment, and multiple counts of unlawful abuse. But Emmerich had already prepared his escape, not from the courthouse but from judgment. That night, before sentencing, he choked himself using the cord of a curtain drawn in his cell. The guard who found him swore that the word "redeemed" was carved into the stone beneath his body, scratched with a button he had pried loose from his coat. The town demanded justice, but justice came in fragments, like the ruins of the institution itself. Scorched, unfinished, still smoldering. Today, few in Asheville speak the Drexler name aloud. The land where the institution once stood is now a municipal storage yard, fenced, padlocked, posted with signs that read "No entry, city property." No one builds there. No children play near the hill. Some say they still hear footsteps at night, even though no foundation remains. Others claim to smell burning cloth in the early morning fog. The past has no grave here. In 1937, city workers digging a new drainage line uncovered a sealed iron box beneath what used to be the East Wing. Inside were the final records, unsent letters, torn prayer books, and one last list, names and numbers of women marked "to be released, pending reassessment." The dates ranged from 1864 to 1869. Not a single one had ever left. The discovery sparked brief outrage. A historical commission formed. There was talk of a museum, a memorial, a formal apology. But as the years passed, money dried up. The last report was quietly shelved in a city archive. The iron box was sent to Raleigh, where it vanished from the record entirely. But the women did not vanish. Descendants of survivors still pass stories down, names not spoken in public, but preserved in locked diaries and whispered warnings. One woman, a retired nurse in Flat Rock, claims her grandmother escaped the Drexler attic and bore scars that no sunlight ever touched. Another, a history teacher in Buncombe County, assigns her students to write essays on invisible institutions, not naming the Drexlers, but making sure the pattern is recognized. Each year on January 11th, the anniversary of the fire, a few people still gather near the gate. They don't carry signs. They don't give speeches. They just stand there, in silence, sometimes placing red ribbons on the fence before walking away. In 1995, a man claiming to be a descendant of Jonas Lyle donated a journal to the local historical society. It contained maps, testimonies, and a single question scratched in shaky ink. How many others were there? No answer followed, just a blank page. Because the Drexler institution wasn't just a crime, it was a blueprint. And the deeper horror wasn't that it existed once, but that it worked. And if history teaches us anything, it's that things that work get repeated, especially in silence.